October the 7th, 1571. On the waters off the coast of Greece, more than 400 warships are closing on each other. Over 100,000 men, soldiers, sailors, and slaves chained to their oars are packed onto wooden decks that will soon run red. It is the largest naval battle the Mediterranean has seen in over 1,000 years. And both sides know exactly what is at stake. For a century, the Ottoman Empire has been the terror of the Mediterranean. Its armies have swallowed empires. Its fleets rule the sea. Cyprus is falling. Christian coasts from Italy to Spain live in fear of Ottoman raiders. And many in Europe whisper that the Turks simply cannot be beaten at sea. Against this tide stands a fragile, quarrelsome alliance that calls itself the Holy League. Spain, Venice, the Pope, and a handful of Italian states that have hated each other for centuries. They have one fleet, one chance. If it is destroyed, there is nothing behind it. The Mediterranean becomes an Ottoman lake, and the coasts of Italy lie open. In the next 5 hours, the naval balance of the world will be decided. This is the Battle of Lepanto. Welcome to Historical Club. To understand Lepanto, you must understand the fear that hung over 16th century Europe. The Ottoman Empire was the superpower of its age. Its territory stretched across 3 continents, from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf. Its capital, Constantinople, had been taken from Christendom a century before, and its advance had barely paused since. Serbia, Greece, Hungary, Rhodes, the coasts of North Africa, one after another. At sea, Ottoman fleets and their corsair allies, heirs of the dreaded Barbarossa, raided Christian shores year after year, burning towns and carrying off thousands of men, women, and children into slavery. Whole stretches of the Italian coast were simply abandoned. To live by the sea was to live in fear of the horizon. And in 1570, the Sultan struck again, at Cyprus, the rich island outpost of Venice. City after city fell. Nicosia was stormed, its population killed or enslaved. And from the last Venetian stronghold, the fortress port of Famagusta, came the news that turned European dread into fury. Famagusta had held out for nearly a year, a few thousand defenders against an enormous besieging army, and its resistance had cost the Ottomans dearly. When the survivors finally surrendered, it was on promised terms of safe passage. Instead, the Venetian commander Marcantonio Brigadin was seized and mutilated, and, according to the accounts that raced across Europe and hardened every heart that heard them, he was flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and paraded as a trophy. It was the spark. Pope Pius V had spent years pleading with the powers of Europe to unite against the Ottoman advance, and for years, rivalry and suspicion had defeated him. Spain distrusted Venice. Venice hesitated to fight the empire it also traded with. But Famagusta changed the arithmetic. Now, at last, the impossible alliance formed. Spain and Venice, bitter rivals, joined with the papacy, Genoa, Savoy, Tuscany, and the Knights of Malta in a holy league, pledged to a single great fleet. That fleet gathered at Messina in Sicily. More than 200 galleys and tens of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and oarsmen drawn from half the nations of Catholic Europe. To command it, they chose a man just 24 years old, Don Juan of Austria, the illegitimate son of the late Emperor Charles V and half-brother of the King of Spain. Young, magnetic, and hungry for glory. And crucially, the one commander with the blood and the bearing to hold together admirals who trusted each other barely more than they trusted the Turk. That his fleet of old enemies sailed at all was his first victory. Facing him was the Ottoman Grand Fleet under Ali Pasha, comparable in numbers, manned by veterans, hardened by a century of triumph, and anchored in the Gulf of Patras near a fortress town the Venetians called Lepanto. Ali Pasha carried the Sultan's own great banner, embroidered with verses of scripture, a sacred standard that had never been lost in battle. On the morning of October the 7th, the two fleets sighted one another across the Gulf, and both, remarkably, chose battle. No feints, no withdrawal. Two empires' worth of sea power sailing straight at each other. They formed battle lines of galleys stretching for miles across the water, the Holy League in 3 divisions with a strong reserve held behind. The Ottomans in a single vast crescent, horns reaching wide as if to embrace and crush the Christian line. Don Juan raised the banner of the Holy League, blessed by the Pope himself, and ordered the Christian convicts rowing his galleys unchained, armed, and promised their freedom. And in a gesture his men never forgot, as 100,000 men closed for battle, the young commander danced a galliard on the gun deck of his flagship, in full armor, in full view of the enemy. The League had one more surprise waiting. Towed out in front of its line were 6 galleasses, huge converted Venetian merchant hulks, slow as floating castles but mounting heavy cannon on all sides in numbers no galley could carry. The Ottomans had never faced anything like them. As the Turkish crescent swept forward, these 6 giants erupted, their broadsides smashing hulls, snapping oars, and scattering the tight Ottoman formations before the fleets had even touched. Then the lines collided along miles of water, and the sea became a battlefield in the oldest and most brutal sense. Galley warfare was not fought at a distance. It was fought hand to hand, deck to deck. Ships rammed, grappled, and lashed themselves together until the Gulf became a single floating melee. A chaos of splintered planks, fallen rigging, and gun smoke so thick that commanders could barely see their own squadrons, with boarding parties surging back and forth across locked decks. On the northern flank, the Ottoman right tried to slip between the Venetian line and the shallows to turn it, and the Venetians, burning to avenge Famagusta, closed the gap and turned the shallows into a killing ground. In the south, the most dangerous man in the Ottoman fleet, the cunning Algerian corsair Uluk Ali, outmaneuvered the League's flank, tore open a gap in the line, and fell upon the isolated galleys within it, capturing the flagship of the Knights of Malta after savage resistance. For a moment, the whole southern battle hung by a thread, until the League's reserve division came driving in and slammed the breach shut. But the battle was decided at the center, where the 2 flagships found each other, as if by appointment. Ali Pasha's Sultana rammed Don Juan's reel head-on, driving deep into her bows, and the 2 great galleys locked together. Around them, the ships of both center divisions piled into the fight until dozens of vessels were lashed into one vast, heaving, burning platform of war. Thousands of men fighting across it as if it were a fortress wall. Twice, Spanish boarding parties stormed onto the Sultana's deck and were hurled back. Ali Pasha's janissaries counterboarded the reel in turn. On the 3rd assault, the Spanish swept the Sultana's deck from bow to stern. Ali Pasha fell, killed in the fighting, or captured and executed on the spot. The accounts differ, and Don Juan is said to have wished him spared. What is certain is what happened next. Above the captured Sultana, the Sultan's sacred banner, never before lost, came down, and the banner of the Holy League rose in its place. Through the smoke, all along the miles of battle, the Ottoman fleet saw it, and the crescent broke. By late afternoon, it was annihilation. Of the great Ottoman armada, all but a few dozen galleys were sunk, burned, or captured. Uluk Ali, ever the survivor, cutting his way out of the wreck with the remnant and carrying the Maltese flagship's banner home as his trophy. Tens of thousands of Ottoman sailors and soldiers were dead or taken. The League's own losses were heavy, thousands killed, whole crews slaughtered. But the fleet stood, and the sea belonged to it. And from the rowing benches of the captured galleys, more than 10,000 Christian slaves were struck from their chains and freed. Men who had rowed under the lash for years, suddenly given back their lives. Among the League's wounded that day was a 24-year-old Spanish soldier who, sick with fever, had refused to stay below decks and took 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, and a third that maimed his left hand forever. His name was Miguel de Cervantes. He would carry that ruined hand, proudly, by his own account, into history as the author of Don Quixote, and to the end of his life he called Lepanto the greatest occasion that past or present ages had seen. When the news reached Europe, church bells rang from Lisbon to Vienna. Venice erupted. In Rome, the Pope proclaimed a feast of thanksgiving that endures on the Catholic calendar to this day. For the first time in living memory, the Ottoman navy, the invincible, had been shattered in open battle. The spell was broken. And yet history demands honesty about what followed. The Holy League, victorious, fell back into its old quarrels within months and won little more. The Ottomans, with staggering resources, rebuilt their fleet within a single year, new hulls, new guns, and returned to the sea. Cyprus was never recovered, and Venice eventually made a humiliating separate peace. When someone taunted the Ottoman Grand Vizier about the defeat, he is said to have replied that in taking Cyprus, the Ottomans had cut off one of Christendom's arms, while at Lepanto, the Christians had merely shaved the Sultan's beard. The arm would never grow back. The beard would. But the beard never grew back the same. Ships could be rebuilt in a year. The tens of thousands of veteran sailors, elite archers, and seasoned commanders lost in those 5 hours could not. The aura of Ottoman invincibility at sea died in the Gulf of Patras, and with it, the momentum of a century. The Mediterranean was never again an Ottoman lake in the making. Europe had learned, at the price of 40,000 lives in a single afternoon, that the tide could be turned. One fleet. One afternoon. The day the crescent broke. If this story moved you, if you believe battles like this deserve to be remembered and remembered well, then do one small thing for us. Tap that like button and subscribe to Historical Club so the next great story finds its way to you. Ring the bell, tell us in the comments which battle we should tell next, and we will see you on the next one.